Newly released figures show a record number of women and children lost their lives in U.S.-led coalition airstrikes in Syria and Iraq last month. According to Airwars, a British non-profit organization, at least 57 women, along with a minimum of 52 children, died in coalition airstrikes in May. According to the group's estimates, last month was the second deadliest month for civilians since coalition airstrikes began in the two countries. The U.S.-led coalition has been conducting strikes inside Syria since August 2014 without any authorization from the Damascus government or a UN mandate. To discuss that further, we're now joined by Tony Gosling, who is an investigative journalist, and he's joining us live now via Skype from Bristol. Mr. Gosling, what do you make of the fact that civilians are bearing the main brunt, seemingly, of these U.S.-led coalition airstrikes, specifically in Syria and Iraq, and of course women and children making up a large part of that?
Well, we're looking at well over 100 women and children killed by U.S. airstrikes last month. Now, this hardly is a line in the news here in Britain and in the United States, whereas even an attack or a kind of incident with a so-called terrorist near the White House, that gets mass coverage. This is 100 women and children, and these cowardly attacks which are taking place from aircraft, I think it's fair to say at least the Russians are taking a great deal more care over trying not to kill civilians. The Americans seem to be making an absolute mess in Syria, but they are acting as the ISIS Air Force. I think it's becoming clearer and clearer to everybody. The America is ISIS's Air Force. They're on the ground. The Americans are in the air doing effectively the same job.
So, Mr. Gosling, you know, this always then brings up the issue of America saying we only carry out precision strikes. We're very careful about civilian casualties. It's Daesh that is using the civilians as human shields, et cetera, et cetera. How do you feel about those arguments?
Well, they're rubbish. They're nonsense. And I can tell you because I spoke to a tornado navigator who was working for the Royal Air Force in the first Gulf War, and he said things go wrong all the time. These guided munitions sometimes just free fall. You hope they're going to be guided by a laser to the target, and they end up just falling straight down from the aircraft without any proper guidance because somebody in their cockpit hasn't flicked one switch, or maybe the thing is faulty. It's very easy to kill civilians. This whole thing about guided smart bombs, they used to call them, weapons is I think actually nonsense. Sometimes they are guided and they hit their targets, but very often they're not. I think we're moving into a pretty dangerous phase in Syria because as it becomes closer and closer to the Syrian government, supported by the Russians, actually taking back their country, which is their absolute right, and it should be guaranteed as well by other members of the UN Security Council. And it's certainly their right under international law to take their own country back as a legitimate elected government, unlike places like Saudi Arabia. We see actually, I think, more danger of the conflict increasing to a conflict between the United States and Russia. And of course, the United States has had its eye on Syria to benefit its Israeli partner in the Middle East. Ever since the 1960s, the 50 years ago, the Six-Day War, the Syrians were, along with the other Arab countries, targeted by Israel and the United States all the way back then. And the bigger picture here really is that you've got the Israelis and the Saudis as two sides of the same coin, working for the United States and the Western powers, mainly not all the European powers, mainly Britain. And I think it would be good, actually, if the Israelis remembered that 2,500 years ago, it was the Persian emperor, the Iranian emperor Cyrus, that actually liberated the Jews from their captivity in Babylon. It seems that the Israelis are very, very choosy about their history. They say this is all their land, but they're prepared to forget the fact the Iranians liberated them all those thousands of years ago. So they're very selective about which bits of the Bible they choose. And I think that they should do their studies a little bit better.
Okay, Mr. Gosling, we'll leave there at that. But of course, as always, we appreciate you sharing your expertise with us.